Hi everyone, I'm Stephen Bay. Today I'm going to walk you through how I made this image from shooting to processing it in Lightroom. So I made this image. It's a picture of a cave in Sunset Cliffs. Sunset Cliffs is an area of San Diego just south of the Ocean Beach Pier, and it's really an amazing place for photographers. You can walk along the top of the cliffs and you can catch some great sunsets there. And even better, you can, if you work your way down to the bottom of the cliffs, you have access to a whole bunch of tide pools and caves there. So I made this image last November, near the beginning of the month. It was one of those days where pretty much everything just came together. We had some nice clouds in the sky and the horizon was clear, so that as the sun set, we get this amazing underlighting on the bottom of the clouds, and you get these great pink and orange colors in the sky. So just to give you some more background on this image, here's this picture of my setup. Right now I'm standing in the middle of the cave, which is really just a crack in the wall. The cave is maybe about a couple feet across, and you can see my camera here, and I'm standing in about a foot or a foot and a half of water there. And usually I like to get to my spot a little bit earlier, so I'm just waiting for the sun to set and hoping that the clouds don't clear off before it does. So normally when I'm in a situation like this where I want everything from the foreground to the background being sharp, I will focus on a point, pretty close to the camera. In this case, I focused on the cave wall here. It's about, maybe 3 to 5 feet in front. I don't remember exactly, but it wasn't too far. I take a shot and then I check for sharpness so that everything is sharp from the foreground all the way to the background. Since we're shooting the sky here and I'm sitting in a cave, we're going to have problems with contrast. That's a pretty big dynamic range in terms of the light levels that need to be captured. And so in cases like this, what I will usually do is I'll bracket. And what I'll do is I'll start with a good exposure for the foreground or the cave walls, and then I'll keep decreasing the exposure by one stop, take another shot, one stop, take another shot, until I'm sure that I have the sky exposed properly. So in this case, if we look at the image, it's at 8 seconds at f11, ISO 100. Next shot, 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, half second, and a quarter second. And by the time you reach the quarter second, it's pretty clear that there's no clipping in the highlights in the sky at all. So usually what I try and do is my preference is to just process a single image and work with that if possible. I will do exposure blending if required, but it's much easier to work with a single image, and I usually prefer to work that way if possible. So I've got this series of 6 images here, and what I'm going to do is just start with the brightest and check to see if the raw highlight recovery is enough so that I can find one image in that sequence where the sky isn't clipped and I have enough detail and light in the shadows to get a good noise-free image. So I'll start with this picture here, the brightest image, and let's go to the develop module. And what I'll do to just check for clipping, I mean, this is pretty clearly going to be clipped, but what you can do is you can just bring down the highlight slider slowly, and you can see that even though the sky is technically not burnt out, it's pretty featureless and it's all posturized. So we didn't get enough, our exposure was not low enough to preserve the details in the highlights. So let's go to the next one, and we bring the exposure down. It's starting to look better, and we're starting to get some detail, but there's still a lot that's burnt out. Moving on to the next one, again, bringing down the highlights, and it's actually looking pretty good. So let's take a closer look at it. If we zoom in, we can see that while a lot of the shadow detail is preserved, we have some issues in the clouds here where you can see it's posturized a little bit. So probably the next image will be fine. So let's bring down the highlights again, and actually that looks pretty good. So if we compare these two images and zoom in and wait for Lightroom to render the image, which is taking a long time. Okay, there you go. Now you can really see the difference in the clouds here, how it's basically very bright and featureless here, and in this image on the right we still keep a lot of the texture. So I'm going to stick with the fourth image here, and I'm going to process this. So normally when I'm trying to process the image, the first thing I do is I ask myself, what's the single biggest thing that's wrong with this image that I would like to fix? In this case, the sky is all bright and washed out, and I really don't like that. So I'm going to try and bring that down. And I'll start using some of the global adjustments. So I'll bring the exposure down a little bit. I'll bring the highlights down. That's looking better. Since we still have some, if we look at the histogram here, we still have some leeway here. So now I'll bring the whites up a tiny bit. So that's looking not bad right now. Maybe tweak it just a little bit more. And so I think that's pretty good right now. So the second thing I don't really like about this image is the dark cave walls. It's really black here and featureless. Sometimes that can be okay, but I prefer in this particular case to have the cave walls be visible and lit. So I'll start with a global adjustment here, and I'll just move the shadow slider up. And you can see it's bringing back the detail quite nicely in the cave walls. I can bring it all the way up to 100. Usually I don't like using very high levels of shadow adjustment, and that's for a couple reasons. One is that sometimes you can get haloing around sharp edges. And if we look here, it actually looks pretty good in this case. I don't really see a lot of haloing here. The other issue is that if I just zoom into the sky and I start playing with the shadow slider, you can see that it's having an impact on the sky area, and it's going to be reducing the contrast there. So let's zoom back out. And so I'll increase the shadows a little bit, maybe to around here. The cave walls are still too dark, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the local adjustment brush, and I'll just plop down a point here, and then I'll hit the O key so I can see where I'm painting. It puts a green overlay on top of where I'm painting so I can see what's being covered. I'll increase the brush a little bit, and just to make sure I have feathering on 100% and I have the auto mask on. And so now I'm just going to paint where the cave walls are. And the auto mask does a good job of not going into the sky, keeping the brush on the cave walls. And I'll just go down here, and I'll paint this little rock in the center, decrease my brush. And then there's this foreground rock here that I will work on a little. Let's hit the erase key and just... Okay, I'll hit the O key to turn it off, and now I want to bring up the cave walls. So increase exposure a little bit. So that's looking pretty good in terms of lightness. The cave walls are still a little bit cool to my taste, and so one thing I typically do fairly frequently is I'll be quite liberal with the white balance controls here, and I'll definitely, increasing these figures definitely does a good job of warming it up. So I think that is pretty good. I'm still looking at this cave wall, and one thing I'd like to do is, you can see how there's these ridges of light, or the ridges in the cave walls are lit up around here and here, and maybe a little bit here. One thing I'd like to do is I'd like to emphasize that. And so I'll take the radial adjustment tool, and I'll draw a little ellipse on my photo, and then I'll hit the O key. And of course, I've got my settings so that it will affect everything outside the ellipse, and I'll just hit the invert button to change that back. I'll rotate it a little bit to line it with the ridge, hit the O key again to turn it off so I can see what the impact of my adjustments, and I'll just move the shadow slider a little bit. And that's looking a lot better. Let me duplicate it, and I will apply it to this section here. Let me duplicate it again, and I'll get this part of the wall here. And I'll duplicate it once more. And I'll get the right side of the cave. Okay, so that's looking quite a bit better. So now I'm looking at this and seeing what else I'd like to change. One thing I'd like to change is I'd like to brighten the darker part of the image here. So in this case, I'll use a gradient tool. And if I hold down the Shift key, it keeps it level. You can see what's being impacted. So I'll just raise the exposure a little bit and the shadows a little bit. And maybe warm it up a touch. So I like that the bottom level is looking, the bottom part of the image is looking a lot brighter. One thing I don't like about this is the reflection of the clouds here are very good, but the clouds here are pretty dim. So I'm going to use another local adjustment. I'm going to use the radial adjustment and to target those areas. And I'll hit the invert button so you can see where it is. It's being applied in the bottom right hand corner. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply my adjustments and affect everything inside the ellipse, and then I will use the range mask to kind of restrict it to just where the clouds are. So let's increase that. And I'm going to use the white balance to warm it up a little. Maybe add a little bit of saturation there. Okay, so I've lightened the clouds, but I've also lightened everything else in the ellipse. What I can do now is turn on the range mask, and I'll use the color option, and I'll take the eyedropper and just select a little point that I want to emphasize. And now, if you hold down the Option key and you move the slider here, you can see exactly what is being impacted. So I can use a very broad selection, in which case everything is being covered, or I can narrow it down, which is what I want to do. So maybe about there. And I'll move this just a little bit there. So now I can go back and I can tweak some of the sliders and see what's going on. So that looks, maybe bring it down just a little. I don't like that this area, the shadow area in front of the rock, is a little bit too dark. So again, I'm going to use the radial adjustment and put down a local adjustment there. Whoops, I have it. I need to invert it. And I will increase the shadows there. And again, I will tweak the white balance there. So that's looking, I think, pretty good there. So what else can I change? Or what else do I need to change? Well, if I look here, I see a little flare spot. And we can zoom in on it. And you can see that it's a lot lighter, and it really bothers me a little bit. So I'll go back to our radial tool and plop down another local adjustment here. Invert it. And I'll drop the highlights down a little and the shadows down. So that looks good. The flare spot is definitely not as noticeable anymore. One thing I don't like is that it has darkened the edge of the ridge a little. So we can try using the luminance mask to try and restrict it just to this darker area. And let's see what happens. Again, if you hold down the Option key, you can kind of see what's being affected. And it's doing an okay job, well, maybe not that great a job of just targeting the area beneath the ridge. There's still a lot of the lighted part of the ridge being selected. So I'll change that, go back to the default settings, and then I'll just use, so for every tool you can modify it with the brush. So you can modify the gradient with the brush, and you can modify the radial tool with the brush. So I'll just click on that, and then I'll click on the erase. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to erase the part of the ellipse that is covering the ridge. Okay, so let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks pretty good. Zoom back out. Maybe darken it down a little bit. Okay, that's looking a lot better now. So what else do I want to change on this image? I think I want to bring down the sky a tiny bit more. So I will create a radial adjustment. I'll make this pretty big. I'll hit the invert key, and I'll use the highlight to bring it down. Yeah, that looks a lot better. I only need to bring it down a tiny little bit. And now we'll use the luminance masking so that it's just impacting the sky and not so much the cave walls. Oops, wrong way. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let me increase the whites a little bit here. And I think I'm getting pretty close to done, so let me just add in my vibrance and saturation. Usually I like doing these last because I'll often change how much I want to add. Maybe a tiny bit of clarity. Okay, so that's looking pretty good to me. Let's go down a little bit more on the tools panel. I definitely like a tiny bit of vignetting. See, I think that looks good. Let me add one more radial tool to the top. And so the thing I would like is I'd like it to be a tiny bit lighter, the shadows to be a tiny bit lighter there. Invert it. And let me apply this only to the darker tones. Okay, that's looking really good now. So the image is basically done. There's one more thing though that I want to mention. My horizon here is not perfectly level, and that really bothers me. There's an easy fix in Lightroom. You can just turn on your profile corrections and then use the rotate command to level it. And then do constrain to crop. I don't like doing that for this particular image, although I will use this for other images. And the reason I don't like it is because I have a couple features that are really close to the edges of the image. So the top of the cave wall and this rock down here. It's a little too close. So I'll back that up. So I'll undo those. And actually, I think this rock here is a little bit too hot, so I will bring that down a little with a radial. invert it. Okay, that's a little bit better. And I see that I have a spot here that I need to clone out. Okay, so, but getting back to the uneven horizon here, what we can do is we can load it into Photoshop and use a tool called the Puppet Warp. So let's edit in Adobe Photoshop. Now the Puppet Warp is a really fantastic tool, and what it's good for is making local warping adjustments without affecting the entire image. So let's wait for this to open in Photoshop. Okay, here it is. Let's duplicate this layer. And now we can do Edit, Puppet Warp. And so the way the Puppet Warp works is you drop down a bunch of pins and that affixes the image. It means that wherever the pins are in place, the image won't move. And then you can put pins down and move them slightly to warp the image how you want. So I can take this and I can drag it down a little bit to straighten the horizon there. And let me put another one there. Just bring it down a tiny bit. And so that is actually looking pretty good. Normally I just leave the mesh, the default parameters for the mesh. You can play around with that, and that sort of impacts, you know, how much of the image moves when you move a pin. So let's hit OK and apply it. And so you can, if I click on this, you can kind of see how it's fixed the horizon. I actually didn't do a perfect job of leveling it, but I think that's good enough for demonstration today. And so let's just save this image. And we can go back to Lightroom. So here's my edit. And so on the left I have my quick edit, and on the right I have the edit that I worked maybe an hour on. And so they're pretty similar. So that's it. This is my first processing video, and I plan to do a bunch more of these. Thank you for watching.